December 18th, 1875, 6:47 in the morning. That's when I heard it. The crack of wood striking flesh. Then a woman's broken sob, and 2 newborn babies crying in the frozen dirt. I'd been hiding from the world for 7 years, but that morning I had a choice. Walk away and stay a coward, or stand up and lose everything. I chose to stand. The afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows of the veteran's home, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floor. Gideon Reed sat in his usual chair by the eastern window, his weathered hands resting on the arms like ancient roots clinging to stone. At 77 years old, he carried his age with the same quiet dignity he'd carried everything else in his life. Straight-backed, silver-haired, with eyes the color of winter granite that still saw more than most men half his age. His grandson, Samuel III, stood before him 16 years old and trembling with the kind of frustration that only the young can truly feel. The boy's hands were clenched at his sides, his jaw set in that stubborn way that reminded Gideon so much of himself at that age. I saw him hit her grandpa, her father, right across the face, and when I started to step in, Dad grabbed my arm and said it wasn't our business, that we don't interfere in other families' affairs. Gideon said nothing for a long moment. He simply looked out the window toward the distant peaks of the Rocky Mountains, their snow-capped summits glowing pink in the fading light. Those mountains had been his home once, his refuge, his prison, his salvation. "Your father is a practical man," Gideon said finally, his voice still strong despite his years. "He's trying to keep you safe, to keep you out of trouble. But that's not right." Samuel's voice cracked with emotion. "She's my age, and he was hurting her, and I just stood there." Gideon turned his gaze to his grandson, and something in those gray eyes seemed to reach across decades, across all the years and all the miles and all the choices that lay between that moment and another moment 45 years past. "Let me tell you a story, boy. It happened in the winter of 1875. I was 32 years old, and I stood exactly where you're standing now, not in this room, not in this moment, but at the same crossroads, the place where doing nothing feels like cowardice and doing something feels like madness." Samuel pulled up a wooden chair and sat, his anger giving way to curiosity. Gideon had never spoken much about his years in the mountains, never talked about the time before he came to town, before he married Samuel's grandmother, before he became the respected elder everyone knew him as. "I'm going to tell you what happened," Gideon said. "Not because I want to brag, not because I want you to think I'm some kind of hero, but because you need to understand something important. When you stand up for what's right, you're not just choosing the hard road, you're choosing the lonely road. And sometimes, boy, you're choosing the road that costs you everything you thought you were." He settled deeper into his chair, and his eyes grew distant, looking not at the room around him, but at something only he could see. A clearing in the mountains, a woman in the dirt, 2 tiny babies crying in a wooden crate, and the sound of a hickory switch cutting through the frozen air. "December 18th, 1875, Gideon began. 6:47 in the morning, that's when I heard it. The cold was the kind that burned, 15 degrees below freezing, the kind of cold that made your teeth ache and your eyes water and your breath crystallize in the air before it even left your lungs. Gideon Reed stood on a granite outcropping 300 feet above a small clearing, his Sharps .50 caliber rifle slung across his shoulder, a pair of field glasses in his hands. He'd been tracking a bull elk for 2 days, following its prints through the high country, waiting for the right shot. But the shot never came. Instead, he heard something that made the elk, the cold, the hunger in his belly, all of it disappear into nothing. The crack of wood striking flesh, sharp, wet, unmistakable. Then a broken sob, a woman's voice trying not to scream. Then the crack again, and the sob weaker each time. Gideon lowered himself into a crouch behind a boulder and brought the field glasses to his eyes. What he saw below made something cold and hard settle in his gut, something that had nothing to do with the temperature. A young woman, maybe 22 years old, lay face down in the frozen dirt. Her brown dress was torn at the shoulders, and her back was a mass of bloody stripes, some fresh and weeping, others already beginning to darken with bruising. Beside her, a rough wooden crate lined with thin cloth held two newborn infants, their faces red and contorted with crying, their tiny fists waving at the frigid air. Standing over the woman was a man Gideon would come to know as Theodore Brennan, though in that moment he was simply a figure of violence. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the build of a man who'd spent his life working with his hands. He held a hickory switch as thick as a man's thumb, and he brought it down again and again with methodical fury. Each strike came with words: venomous, hateful, whore, crack, disgrace, crack, devil's daughter, crack. The woman didn't fight back, didn't try to protect herself. She simply lay there taking it, her only movement the involuntary flinch each time the switch fell. But her eyes, Gideon could see, even from this distance, her eyes were fixed on the crate where her babies cried. Even through her own agony, she was watching them, making sure they were still breathing. That detail, small as it was, told Gideon everything he needed to know about her. He began counting, an old habit from the war when knowing the rhythm of enemy fire could mean the difference between life and death. 23 strikes. The man had hit her 23 times before his arm finally began to tire. 11 minutes of sustained violence, and the woman had taken every moment of it without begging, without pleading, without giving the man the satisfaction of breaking her spirit, even as he broke her body. Gideon's jaw clenched. His finger moved instinctively toward the trigger of his rifle, and for a brief moment, a very brief moment, he considered it. One shot. Center mass. The man would be dead before he hit the ground. Justice served quick and clean. But 7 years of living alone in these mountains had taught Gideon Reed something important. Timing mattered more than rage. Rush in too soon, and you saved nothing. Wait too long, and you lost everything. The trick was finding the exact right moment, the instant when action would actually make a difference. So he waited, he watched, and he counted the man's breaths as they came harder and harder with exertion. Finally, Theodore Brennan dropped the switch into the dirt. He stood there for a moment, chest heaving, looking down at his daughter with something that might have been disgust, or might have been grief, or might have been both. Then he spat in the dirt beside her head and spoke in a voice loud enough to carry even up to Gideon's position. 3 days. You've got 3 days to take those bastards and get off my land. If I see your face after that, I'll finish what I started here. He turned and walked toward the tree line, his gait stiff with exhausted anger and something that looked almost like satisfaction. As if he believed he'd done something righteous, something necessary, as if beating his own daughter until she could barely breathe was somehow an act of love. Gideon waited until the man disappeared into the pines, waited another 5 minutes to be sure. Then he started to move, picking his way down the rocky slope with the practiced silence of a man who'd spent 7 years learning to move like a ghost. That's when he heard it, the sound that stopped him cold, a boot scraping against stone. Behind him, 20 yards back. Someone had been watching him watch the clearing. Gideon froze. Every muscle in his body tensed. His hand moved slowly, carefully toward the Bowie knife at his belt. The rifle was too long for close quarters. If this was one of Brennan's men, if they'd circled around and caught him, then it would be knife work, fast and brutal. He waited, listening, counting heartbeats. Then came a sound he didn't expect, a dry, raspy chuckle that sounded like 2 stones grinding together. "Easy there, son. I'm too old and too tired to be a threat to anybody." Gideon turned slowly, knife now in hand, and saw a man stepping out from behind a cluster of boulders. 65 if he was a day maybe older. White hair pulled back in a long braid, weathered face the color of old leather, dressed in buckskins and moccasins that marked him as someone who lived the same kind of life Gideon did. His hands were raised, palms out, showing no weapons. "Name's Jack Tanner," the old man said. "Been living in these mountains longer than you've been alive, I'd wager. And I know what you're thinking right now." "You don't know anything about what I'm thinking." "Don't I?" Jack's eyes, still sharp despite his age, flicked toward the clearing below. "You're thinking you want to go down there and help that girl. And you're thinking that if you do, you're going to make yourself an enemy you can't afford. And you're thinking that maybe, just maybe, you should turn around and walk away and let this be somebody else's problem." Gideon said nothing, because the old man was exactly right. Jack took a step closer, lowering his hands now. "The man down there is Theodore Brennan. You know that name?" "No." "Then you're lucky. Or you were until about 10 minutes ago. Brennan owns half the valley around Silverpine, used to be a sergeant in the war, killed 17 men with his bare hands, or so the story goes. Now he's a rancher, and he rules his land like it's his own private kingdom. That girl is Catherine, his only daughter." Gideon looked back toward the clearing. Catherine hadn't moved. She was still lying there, her breath coming in shallow gasps, occasionally trying to reach toward the crate where her babies cried. "And the father of those children?" Gideon asked. Jack shook his head. "No father, or rather, no husband. There was a man, traveling preacher named Samuel, smooth talker, promised Catherine he'd marry her, got her with child, then disappeared the moment he found out, left her to face Theodore's wrath alone. And Brennan did that to his own daughter because she was pregnant. Not just because she was pregnant. Catherine's mother, Rebecca, died last year giving birth to those twins down there. Complications. Theodore blames Catherine for it. Says if she'd kept herself pure, if she'd honored the family, Rebecca would still be alive. So he's been beating that girl every day since the babies were born 2 weeks ago, trying to drive the sin out of her, he says, trying to make her pure again. The word pure tasted like ash in Gideon's mouth. He'd seen a lot of things called pure in his life. Most of them were anything but. "What do you want from me?" Gideon asked. Jack met his eyes. "I want to warn you. If you go down there, if you help that girl, Theodore Brennan will hunt you. He's got 12 men working for him. Good men with rifles and no qualms about using them. He'll track you across these mountains until he finds you, and when he does, he'll kill you. Slow if he's feeling righteous, fast if he's feeling merciful." "Then why tell me at all? Why not just let me walk away?" For the first time, something hard and bitter crossed Jack Tanner's weathered face. "Because Theodore Brennan killed my brother 10 years ago. Land dispute. Shot him in the back and called it self-defense. No witnesses willing to testify. No law willing to challenge him. I've been waiting for someone, anyone, to stand up to that man. But nobody does. Nobody dares." He pulled something from inside his coat, a folded letter sealed with wax. "This is testimony. Everything Theodore's done. Names of people he's killed, land he's stolen, witnesses he's intimidated. I wrote it 5 years ago, but I never had the courage to submit it. I have a family. Had a family. My wife passed last winter. My children are grown and gone. I don't have anything left to lose anymore." He held the letter out. Gideon didn't take it. "You're asking me to be your weapon," Gideon said. "Your instrument of revenge. I'm asking you to do what's right. There's a difference." Gideon looked at the letter, then down at the clearing. Catherine was moving now, crawling inch by painful inch toward her babies. She wasn't trying to escape, wasn't trying to save herself. She was trying to reach her children, even broken, even beaten, until she could barely move. Her only thought was for them. Gideon saw his own daughter in that moment. Anna, 4 years old when the influenza took her. He'd been out hunting 4 days into the high country when it happened. By the time he got home, she was already in the ground. Cold earth packed over a tiny body he never got to hold one last time. Never got to tell goodbye. Never got to tell her that her father loved her more than his own life. The memory of that, the weight of that failure, had driven him into these mountains 7 years ago. Driven him away from people, away from responsibility, away from anything that might require him to protect someone he couldn't save. But here now, he had a choice. Walk away and let history repeat itself. Let 2 more babies grow up without protection, without someone willing to stand between them and violence. Or step forward and face whatever consequences came. He reached out and took the letter from Jack's hand. "What's the plan?" Jack asked. "First I get them somewhere safe, then we figure out the rest." Jack nodded slowly. "Theodore will send men looking, probably already has. You'll need to move fast." "I know how to move." "And you'll need help. You can't protect a woman and 2 infants alone, not with Brennan's men hunting you." "I've been alone for 7 years. I know how to survive." Jack studied him for a long moment, then shook his head. "Son, there's a difference between surviving and living. I think maybe it's time you learned that again." Gideon descended the slope in silence, his boots finding purchase on loose scree and frozen earth with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent years learning this terrain. The cold bit at his exposed skin, but he barely noticed it. His focus was entirely on the clearing below, on the woman who'd stopped moving, on the babies whose cries had grown weaker. When he reached the edge of the clearing, he paused. Not to reconsider, not to second-guess, but to approach in a way that wouldn't frighten Catherine more than she'd already been frightened. He'd learned long ago that rescue could feel like another kind of attack if you did it wrong. He stepped into the open, moving, slowly keeping his rifle pointed at the ground. Then he did something that might have seemed strange to an observer. He walked past Catherine without looking at her, went to his pack, pulled out his canteen and set it down in the dirt 3 feet from her head. Then he backed away 6 paces and lowered himself into a crouch, his eyes fixed on the tree line where Brennan had disappeared. He didn't speak, didn't look at her, just waited. 2 full minutes passed in silence. Catherine's breathing was ragged, painful to hear. The baby's cries had subsided to weak whimpers. The cold pressed down on everything like a physical weight. Finally, in a voice that sounded like gravel scraping against wood, Catherine spoke. "Are you one of his men?" "No." Another silence. Gideon could see her hand moving slightly, reaching toward the canteen, but not quite touching it. Fear and thirst warring in her. "Then who are you? Someone who can't walk past this and pretend it didn't happen?" The simplicity of the answer seemed to surprise her. Her hand moved closer to the canteen, touched it, pulled it toward her with shaking fingers. She managed to lift it to her lips and drink, and the sound of her swallowing was desperate, grateful, the sound of someone who'd been dying of thirst without even realizing it. When she lowered the canteen, the baby's cries grew louder, more insistent, the sound of hungry infants who'd been neglected for too long. Gideon stood and walked toward the wooden crate. Catherine's whole body tensed, but she was too weak to move, too exhausted to do anything but watch as this stranger approached her children. He knelt beside the crate and looked down at 2 tiny faces, red and furious and alive. 2 girls he thought twins, though at this age it was hard to tell them apart, both wrapped in thin cloth that provided almost no protection against the cold, both with lips starting to turn that dangerous shade of blue that meant hypothermia was setting in. Without a word, Gideon shrugged out of his heavy fur-lined coat and wrapped it around both babies, tucking it in carefully, using his own body heat trapped in the fabric to warm them. Then he checked their breathing, their color, their responsiveness. Newborns were fragile. These 2 were on the edge. He looked up and found Catherine watching him. There were tears streaming down her face, cutting clean tracks through the dirt and blood. Not tears of pain, though she had plenty of reason for those. Tears of something else. Relief, maybe. Or disbelief. The simple shock of seeing someone treat her children with gentleness when their own grandfather had shown them nothing but contempt. "Can you stand?" Gideon asked. "I don't know." "Will you try?" She nodded. Gideon stood and extended his hand. She looked at it like it might be a trap. Like any moment he might pull back and laugh at her for believing someone would actually help. But slowly, painfully, she reached up and placed her hand in his. His grip was firm, but careful, mindful of her injuries. With one smooth pull, he brought her to her feet. Her legs buckled immediately. He caught her one arm around her shoulders, keeping his hand away from the torn flesh of her back. "I can't," she whispered. "I can't walk." "You don't have to walk far. Just to lean. I'll do the rest." He guided her arm around his shoulders, taking most of her weight. With his free hand he lifted the crate holding the babies. Then he started walking, Catherine leaning against him, the babies quiet now under the warmth of his coat, heading toward the tree line and the mountains beyond. "Where are we going?" Catherine managed to ask after they'd gone 50 yards. "Somewhere safe." "There's nowhere safe. He'll find us." "Not where I'm taking you. Not in the high country. Your father doesn't know those mountains like I do." "Why are you doing this?" Gideon didn't answer immediately. They walked in silence for another 100 yards before he spoke, his voice low and rough. "Because 7 years ago I lost my daughter. She was 4 years old. Influenza. I was out hunting when it happened. By the time I got home, she was already buried. I never got to say goodbye. Never got to hold her one last time. I've been running from that ever since. Running from people, from responsibility, from anything that might make me feel that kind of failure again." He paused, adjusting his grip on the crate as they started up a steeper incline. "But running doesn't change what happened. Doesn't bring her back. Doesn't make the guilt any lighter. So maybe just this once I can stop running. Maybe I can be there for someone who needs it. Maybe I can do something that matters." Catherine said nothing, but her grip on his shoulder tightened slightly, and in that small gesture Gideon felt something he hadn't felt in 7 years. Connection. Purpose. The sense that he was exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what needed to be done. Behind them the clearing fell away into the distance. Ahead the mountains rose like granite sentinels, cold and unforgiving and absolutely perfect for disappearing. 3 hours into the climb, Gideon called for a rest. They'd reached the first waypoint he'd mentioned to Jack, a small spring that bubbled up from between 2 boulders before freezing into a thin sheet of ice on the rocks below. The spot was sheltered from the wind, surrounded by dense pines, and offered good sight lines back down the trail. If anyone was following, he'd see them coming. He set the crate down carefully and helped Catherine lower herself onto a flat rock. Her face was gray with exhaustion and pain. Her breathing came in short, shallow gasps. But she was still conscious, still aware, still fighting. "Rest here," Gideon said. "I need to check your wounds." She nodded weakly. Gideon went to work with practiced efficiency. He'd learned field medicine during the war, and he'd learned herbal remedies from his grandmother, who'd been half Cherokee and had known things about healing that most white doctors had never bothered to learn. He broke the ice on the spring and filled his canteen with fresh water, then pulled a leather pouch from his pack. Inside were bundles of dried herbs: yarrow for bleeding, comfrey for wounds, willow bark for pain. He crushed the herbs between his palms, mixing them with water to form a thick paste. Then he knelt behind Catherine and gently, very gently, began cleaning the wounds on her back. She flinched, bit down on her lip to keep from crying out, but she didn't pull away. "Yarrow stops bleeding," Gideon said, speaking as much to distract her as to inform her. "Comfrey helps wounds heal. It'll sting now, but in a few days you'll feel the difference." He worked in silence after that, spreading the paste across each cut and welt, then wrapping clean strips of buckskin around her torso to hold it in place. When he finished, he moved around to face her and checked her eyes, her color, her breathing. "You'll live," he said, "but you need rest, real rest, not just a few minutes on a rock. We can't stop. He'll find us." "Not today. Today we have time. Tomorrow might be different." Catherine looked at the babies in the crate. They were sleeping now, warmed by Gideon's coat and the relative shelter of the trees. "They need milk, real milk. I don't have enough. My body is too weak." "I know. I'm working on that problem." "How?" "There's a homestead 2 hours from here. Man named Morrison. Keeps goats. I trade with him sometimes. Meat for milk. He won't ask questions. And if he does, then I'll answer them in a way that keeps you safe." Catherine studied his face, searching for something. Deception, maybe, or false promises. But whatever she was looking for, she didn't seem to find it. Instead, she found something else, something that made her shoulders relax just slightly, made the tension in her jaw ease. "What's your name?" she asked. It was such a simple question, but coming from her after everything she'd been through, it felt significant. Names mattered. Names meant you saw someone as a person, not just a rescuer or a threat or a tool to be used. "Gideon," he said. "Gideon Reed." "I'm Catherine, but you probably already know that." "I do. The old man Jack, he told me." "Jack Tanner. He's still alive." Very much so. And he's the one who told me what your father's been doing, what he's been planning." Catherine's face darkened. "My father. I can barely call him that anymore. Fathers protect their children. They don't beat them half to death in the dirt. He blames you for your mother's death." "I know. He's told me. Every day since she died. As if I chose to get pregnant. As if I chose for her to have complications during the birth. As if any of this was my fault instead of just the way life happened." She looked down at her hands, which were shaking. "Samuel told me he loved me, told me we'd be married. I believed him. I was stupid." "You weren't stupid. You trusted someone who didn't deserve it. That's not the same thing." "Isn't it?" "No. Because if you couldn't trust anyone, if you had to suspect everyone of lying all the time, you'd never be able to live. You'd spend your whole life alone, afraid to let anyone close." He said it without irony, without seeming to realize he was describing exactly how he'd been living for the past 7 years. But Catherine caught it. A small, sad smile touched her lips. "Like you." Gideon's jaw tightened. He stood and moved away, checking the trail below. "We should move soon. Another 2 hours to the cave. We can't risk staying here after dark." Catherine didn't push. She simply nodded and began trying to stand. Gideon returned and helped her to her feet. As they prepared to continue, she spoke again, her voice soft. "Thank you, Gideon Reed, for seeing us, for not walking away. Don't thank me yet. We've got a long way to go. And your father isn't going to give up easily." "I know, but at least now we have a chance." While Gideon and Catherine made their way up the mountain, Theodore Brennan sat in his study, a glass of whiskey in his hand and murder in his heart. The room was lined with books he'd never read, trophies from animals he'd shot, and a single photograph on his desk. His wife Rebecca, taken the year before she died. She was smiling in the picture. He couldn't remember the last time he'd seen her smile in life. A knock came at the door. Theodore didn't look up. "Come in." Deputy Martin entered, hat in hand, face nervous. Martin was young, maybe 25, and he still had the kind of conscience that made him hesitate before doing terrible things. Theodore hated that about him, but Martin was loyal, and loyalty was worth more than a clean conscience. "Sir, we went back to check like you ordered, but she's gone. Catherine and the babies. All of them." Theodore's hand tightened on his glass. "Gone." "Yes, sir. But there were tracks. Boot prints. Large. A man's. And marks in the snow like something heavy being dragged. Heading northwest. Into the high country. A man." Theodore spoke the words like a curse. "Someone helped her." "Looks that way, sir." Theodore stood and walked to the window. Beyond the glass, the mountains rose against the sky, their peaks sharp and white and unforgiving. Somewhere up there his daughter was running with a stranger, running from him. The rage that filled him was a living thing, hot and bitter and righteous. But beneath the rage was something else, something he'd never admit to anyone, not even himself. Fear. Fear that Catherine would never come back. Fear that he'd lost her the same way he'd lost Rebecca. Fear that he was becoming exactly what his father had been, exactly what he'd sworn he'd never become. But fear could be pushed down, could be drowned in whiskey and rage and the absolute certainty that he was right, that he'd done what needed to be done, that discipline was love even when it looked like violence. "Get 4 men," Theodore said. "The best we have. Tell them to pack for 5 days. Rifles, ammunition, cold weather gear. We're going into the mountains." "Yes, sir. And when we find them." Theodore turned from the window. His face was hard, expressionless, the face of a man who'd made peace with what he was about to do. "When we find them, we bring Catherine home. The man who took her we deal with. Final. The babies." He paused. "We'll see." Martin shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, they're your grandchildren. They're bastards, born of sin. They're proof of Catherine's shame. And if she'd never gotten pregnant, if she'd never brought that preacher's sin into our house, Rebecca would still be alive. But, sir, that's an order, deputy. Get the men. We leave at first light." Martin nodded and left. Theodore returned to his desk, to the photograph of Rebecca. He picked it up, studying her face, that frozen smile that would never age, never fade, never judge him for what he was about to do. "I'm doing this for you," he whispered to the photograph. "For your memory, for the family name. I won't let Catherine destroy everything we built." The photograph, of course, said nothing. But in Theodore's mind he could hear Rebecca's voice, soft and sad and full of disappointment. The voice of the woman he'd loved, the woman he'd failed, the woman whose death he couldn't accept had simply been an accident of biology and bad luck. Someone had to be blamed. Someone had to pay. And if it couldn't be the man who'd gotten Catherine pregnant, if it couldn't be fate or God or the random cruelty of the universe, then it would be Catherine herself, and the man who'd stolen her away. Theodore poured himself another drink and began cleaning his rifle. Tomorrow, the hunt would begin. By the time Gideon and Catherine reached the cave, the sun had set, and the temperature had dropped another 10 degrees. Catherine was barely conscious, leaning so heavily on Gideon that he was practically carrying her. The babies had begun crying again, thin wails that spoke of hunger and cold and the simple primal fear of infants who sensed something was wrong. The cave was exactly where Gideon had told Jack it would be, hidden behind a thick curtain of mountain laurel that had somehow survived the winter, sheltered by an overhang of granite that kept the wind at bay. The entrance was narrow, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through sideways, but inside it opened up into a space about 15 feet deep and 12 feet wide. Not large, but enough. More than enough. Gideon had been living here for 3 years, ever since he'd moved up from his previous shelter lower on the mountain. He'd furnished it slowly, carefully, with things he'd made or traded for. Wool blankets, a small fire pit with a natural chimney that vented through a crack in the stone, a pile of firewood already split and dried, stores of dried meat and pine nuts and herbs, tin cups, a small axe, everything a man needed to survive alone. And there, on a natural shelf in the rock, the things he'd never been able to throw away. His mother's Bible, the pages worn soft from her touch, a whittling knife his father had given him the day he left for the war, and a small tin box that he never opened that held a photograph of a woman and a little girl who would never grow older. He helped Catherine to the back of the cave and lowered her onto a pile of blankets. She collapsed immediately, her body finally giving up now that it knew it was somewhere safe. Gideon covered her with furs, checked her breathing, made sure she was warm. Then he turned his attention to the babies. They were in bad shape, dehydrated, underfed. Their cries were getting weaker instead of stronger, which was a terrible sign. Catherine's milk production had dropped to almost nothing under the stress and trauma of the past weeks. These infants needed real food, and they needed it soon. Gideon built a fire small and efficient, just enough to warm the cave without creating too much smoke. Then he took his canteen and mixed water with crushed pine nuts and a tiny bit of rendered fat from his stores. It wasn't milk. It wasn't even close. But it was calories, and calories meant survival. He soaked strips of clean cloth in the mixture and let the babies suck on them. They took it greedily, desperately, making small sounds of relief and satisfaction. It would keep them alive for tonight, but tomorrow he'd have to make good on his promise to Catherine. Tomorrow he'd have to find real milk. While the babies fed, Catherine's eyes opened. She watched Gideon working with her children, this stranger who'd appeared out of nowhere and saved them all. Watched the gentleness of his hands, the patience in his movements, the way he murmured soft reassurances to infants who couldn't possibly understand the words but responded to the tone nonetheless. "You've done this before," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Gideon didn't look up. "Yes. Your daughter, the one who died." Her name was Anna. She had her mother's eyes, blue like a summer sky. She laughed at everything. Birds, clouds the way dust motes danced in sunlight. She made everything seem magical. "I'm sorry." "So am I." He finished feeding the babies and set them carefully in the wooden crate which he'd lined with soft furs to keep them warm. They settled immediately, their tiny bodies relaxing into sleep now that their hunger had been partially sated. Catherine was watching him still. "Why are you really doing this, Gideon Reed? And don't tell me it's just because of your daughter. There's something else." Gideon was silent for a long time. He sat by the fire staring into the flames, his face carved from shadow and light. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet Catherine had to strain to hear it. "Because I've been running for 7 years. Running from the memory of coming home and finding my family dead and buried without me. Running from the guilt of not being there when they needed me most. Running from everyone and everything, because if I never got close to anyone, I could never fail them." He looked up, meeting her eyes across the firelight. "But running doesn't work. It just means you fail alone. So maybe it's time I stopped running. Maybe it's time I stood still and faced what I've been avoiding. The simple fact that life is fragile and people die, and sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. But sometimes, just sometimes, you can make a difference. You can be there. You can help. And maybe that's enough." Catherine's eyes filled with tears. "You're a good man, Gideon Reed." "I'm a scared man who's tired of being alone. But I'll take good man if you're offering it." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. Then exhaustion claimed her, and she slipped into sleep. Gideon sat watch through the night. He fed the fire when it burned low, checked the babies every hour, listened to the wind outside and the small sounds of the cave settling around him. And for the first time in 7 years, he didn't feel like he was hiding. He felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. Just before dawn, he heard it. The distant sound of horses moving through the timber below. 5, maybe 6 riders, moving slowly, carefully searching. Theodore Brennan had found their trail faster than Gideon expected. Much faster. Gideon moved to the cave entrance and peered through the laurel. In the gray pre-dawn light he could see them. 5 riders spreading out in a search pattern, working their way up the mountain. They were still 2 hours away at their current pace. But they were coming. He returned to the fire and began making preparations. They couldn't stay here. Not now. But Catherine couldn't travel yet, and the babies couldn't survive another long journey in this cold, which meant Gideon had to change the situation. He had to stop Theodore before Theodore reached the cave, had to turn the hunter into the hunted, had to make this mountain into a trap instead of a refuge. As the sun rose and light filled the cave, Gideon looked at the sleeping woman and her 2 tiny children. 7 years ago, he'd failed to protect the people he loved. Today, he'd make damn sure history didn't repeat itself, even if it meant becoming the thing he'd spent 7 years avoiding. A man willing to fight, a man willing to kill, a man willing to stand between the innocent and the violent, no matter what it cost him. The mountain man was done running. The reckoning was about to begin. Dawn broke cold and sharp over the mountains, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold that would have been beautiful if Gideon had time to appreciate them. But beauty was a luxury he couldn't afford this morning. Not with 5 riders working their way up the slope below, not with Catherine barely able to stand, and not with 2 newborn infants who needed more than he could give them, with pine nut paste and improvised cloth feeders. He moved with quiet efficiency around the cave, gathering what he'd need for the day ahead. His Sharps rifle cleaned and loaded. His Bowie knife sharp enough to split a hair. Ammunition, jerky rope, and the small leather pouch of herbs his grandmother had taught him to carry. Everything a man needed to either save lives or end them depending on how the day unfolded. Catherine stirred as he worked, her eyes opening slowly. For a moment she looked confused, as if she couldn't remember where she was or how she'd gotten there. Then memory returned, and with it the pain. Her face tightened, but she didn't cry out. She'd learned to suffer in silence, and Gideon hated that she'd had to learn that lesson. "They're coming, aren't they?" she asked, her voice rough from sleep and dehydration. "Yes, 5 riders, about 2 hours below us. They're searching, but they haven't found the cave yet." 2 hours, that's not enough time for us to run. We're not running, not yet. Gideon knelt beside her and checked the bandages on her back. The wounds were beginning to heal, but slowly. "How do you feel?" "Like I was beaten half to death and then carried up a mountain." "Can you walk?" "I can try, but not far, not fast." Gideon nodded. He'd expected as much. "Then you'll stay here, hidden. I'm going to move you and the babies to a place in the back of the cave. A crack in the rock that opens into a small chamber above this one. It's tight, but it's hidden. Even if someone comes into this cave, they won't find it unless they know it's there. Catherine's hand shot out and grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. You're going out there. You're going to face them. Not face them. Stop them, or at least slow them down. Make them think twice about continuing. They'll kill you. They'll try. Gideon, please. Just take us and run. Find another cave, another mountain. We can disappear. He covered her hand with his own, his calloused palm, rough against her skin. Catherine, your father has hired a tracker, the best there is, a man named Silas Cutter, half Apache, half white, and all hunter. He can track a shadow across rock, a ghost through water. If we run, he'll find us. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but eventually. And when he does, you'll still be weak, and the babies will still be helpless, and I'll still be one man against 5 or more. So what's the alternative? The alternative is, I change the terms. Make this mountain into something they fear instead of something they hunt through. Make them understand that coming after you has a cost they might not want to pay. Catherine studied his face, searching for something. Courage or foolishness, or perhaps the line where the two became indistinguishable. You're going to kill them. I'm going to defend you. There's a difference. Is there? Gideon stood and moved to the cave entrance, peering out through the laurel curtain. The riders were closer now. He could see them more clearly. Theodore Brennan in the lead, tall and rigid in his saddle. 4 others spread out behind him, rifles across their saddles, eyes scanning the terrain. Professional, cautious, dangerous. When this is over, Gideon said without turning around, you're going to have to make a choice. You can keep hiding, keep running, raise those babies in fear and secrecy, or you can fight back, face your father in a court of law, testify against him, use that letter Jack gave me and your own witness to bring him to justice. A court Theodore owns the judge in Silverpine, owns half the town. No one would dare rule against him. Not Silverpine, Denver, federal court. Jack says he has contacts, people who listen. Catherine was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was different, harder. My father didn't just beat me, Gideon. I've seen him do worse. I watched him burn the McAllister ranch when they wouldn't sell their land. Watched him threaten the sheriff into silence. Heard him boast about killing a sheep farmer who grazed too close to his property. I stayed quiet because I was afraid. Because he was my father, and I thought that meant something. She struggled to sit up, wincing at the pain but pushing through it. But it doesn't mean anything, does it? Being family doesn't give you the right to hurt people, doesn't make violence into love, doesn't turn cruelty into discipline. No, it doesn't. Then yes. When this is over, if we survive, I'll testify. I'll tell everyone what he is, what he's done. And if they don't believe me, at least I'll know I tried. Gideon turned and looked at her. In the firelight, with her jaw set and her eyes bright with determination, she looked nothing like the broken woman he'd found in the dirt less than 24 hours ago. She looked like someone discovering her own strength, someone who'd been beaten down but refused to stay down. Good, he said. Then let's make sure you survive to get that chance. He spent the next 30 minutes moving Catherine and the babies to the hidden chamber. The passage was narrow, barely 18 inches wide, and it climbed steeply through the rock for about 15 feet before opening into a small space no bigger than a storage closet. It was cramped and dark and uncomfortable, but it was safe. Even if someone came into the main cave and searched every corner, they'd never find this chamber unless they knew exactly where to look. He left Catherine with water-jerky extra blankets and strict instructions. No matter what you hear, stay quiet. Don't come out until I come back for you. If something happens to me, if I don't return by tomorrow morning, wait until nightfall and then head north. Follow the ridgeline. 3 days of hard travel and you'll reach a trading post called Bennett's Station. Tell them Jack Tanner sent you. They'll help. Catherine grabbed his hand one more time. Come back, Gideon. I plan to. Then he was gone, slipping out of the cave and into the cold morning air, leaving behind the woman and children he'd somehow become responsible for in the space of a single day. The weight of that responsibility sat heavy on his shoulders, but it wasn't an unwelcome weight. It was the weight of mattering, of having a reason to fight instead of just surviving day to day. He moved quickly through the trees using game trails and rock formations he'd memorized over years of living on this mountain. He knew every boulder, every fallen log, every place where the stone offered good footing, and every place where it crumbled treacherously. This was his territory, his advantage, and he intended to use every bit of it. His first line of defense was already in place set the night before when he couldn't sleep. A tripwire stretched across the eastern approach 30 yards from the cave entrance, tied to 4 tin cups that would clang together if disturbed. It wasn't much, but it would give warning, buy him a few extra seconds to react. His second defense was more elaborate. A carefully balanced pile of rocks and dead wood positioned on a narrow ledge above the main trail, held in place by a single stick. Pull the stick and 50 pounds of debris would come crashing down on anyone passing below. Not enough to kill, probably, but enough to maim, enough to make them reconsider. His third defense was himself, positioned on high ground with a clear field of fire and the morning sun behind him, making him invisible to anyone looking up from below. One shot from his sharps could drop a man at 300 yards. 5 men meant 5 shots. The question was whether he could make all 5 before they scattered and took cover. The question was whether he wanted to. Gideon had killed men before, during the war when it was kill or be killed, and the rules were simple, and the enemy wore a different uniform. But that was years ago, and these men, whatever else they might be, weren't soldiers. They were ranch hands following orders, loyal to a paycheck and a man who ruled through fear. Did that make them guilty enough to die? He pushed the thought aside. Worry about philosophy later. Right now, worry about survival. The riders came into view just after 8 in the morning. Theodore Brennan led the way, his face set in hard lines, his eyes scanning the terrain with the practiced gaze of a man who'd hunted both animals and men. Behind him rode Deputy Martin Young and nervous, his hand never far from his rifle. Then came 3 others Gideon didn't recognize. Hard men with weather-beaten faces and the kind of casual confidence that came from never having lost a fight. They were moving in a classic search pattern, spread out in a loose line, each man covering different terrain, calling out to each other occasionally to maintain contact. Professional, disciplined. This wasn't their first manhunt. Gideon watched them come, his finger resting lightly on the trigger of his rifle, his breathing slow and controlled. He could take Theodore first, drop him with a shot to the chest. The others would scatter, but in that moment of chaos, maybe he could get a second shot off, maybe even a third. But then what? They'd know where he was. They'd have cover, and it would turn into a siege, a waiting game, and eventually they'd find the cave, or he'd run out of ammunition, or one of them would get lucky with a shot. No, better to make them afraid, make them uncertain, make them believe this mountain held more danger than they'd bargained for. He shifted his aim away from Theodore and toward the youngest of the ranch hands, a man who looked barely out of his teens. Not to kill, just to warn. Gideon squeezed the trigger. The sharps roared, echoing off the rocks like thunder. The bullet whined through the air and struck the rock 3 feet from the young ranch hand's horse. The horse reared, screaming. The rider tumbled backward out of the saddle, landing hard on the frozen ground. The other riders scattered immediately, diving off their horses and scrambling for cover behind rocks and trees. Shouts filled the air. Confusion and anger and fear all mixed together. Theodore's voice cut through the chaos. "Hold position. Stay in cover. Identify the shooter." Gideon was already moving. He'd fired from one position, but he wasn't going to stay there. That was how you got killed. Fire and move. Fire and move. Keep them guessing. He dropped down the backside of his perch and sprinted 50 yards through dense timber, then climbed to a new position with a different angle of view. By the time he settled in, the riders had reorganized. Theodore was barking orders, directing his men to spread out and search the ridgeline where the shot had come from. But they were looking at the wrong place. Gideon was already somewhere else. He raised his rifle again, but before he could fire, a voice spoke from directly behind him. "On set good trap mountain man. Nyung toi set better." Gideon froze. The voice was quiet, almost conversational, but it carried an accent he recognized. Apache, mixed with something else. English spoken by someone who'd learned it as a second language and never quite lost the rhythms of the first. He turned slowly, keeping his hands visible, and found himself looking at a man who seemed to have materialized from the air itself. 40 years old, maybe. Lean and wiry, with dark skin, high cheekbones, and gray-streaked black hair worn long. He was dressed in a mixture of buckskin and Apache clothing, and he held a Sharps rifle identical to Gideon's aimed rock-steady at Gideon's chest. "Silas Cutter," Gideon said. It wasn't a question. "On no toy. Good. Save time." Cutter's English was functional but stilted, mixing Apache pronouns with English words in a way that marked him as someone who lived between two worlds and belonged fully to neither. "On the one who take Brennan's daughter. I'm the one who saved her from being beaten to death. Same thing to him. He pay me find her, bring her back, deal with man who take her." "How much is he paying you?" $50. Good money. "I'll pay you 60 to walk away." Cutter smiled, but there was no humor in it. "On think toy do this for money." "I think everyone does everything for money, or revenge, or pride. Which one drives you?" "Curiosity." Cutter's smile widened slightly. "Toy hear about on mountain man who live alone 7 year, who track like Apache, who know these peak like own hand. Toy want see if story true, want see if on good as people say." "And am I?" "On good, set nice trap, make good first shot. But on make mistake, on think toy follow other men. Think toy come from below, but toy circle around, come from above. Apache teaching, always take high ground, always approach from unexpected direction." Gideon's mind was racing. Cutter had the drop on him. One wrong move and this was over. But the tracker was talking, which meant he wasn't shooting, which meant he wanted something. Information, maybe, or just the satisfaction of proving he was better. "So what now?" Gideon asked. "You going to shoot me? Take me back to Brennan for proof?" "To think about it. But then to remember something. Brennan say bring daughter back. Say deal with man who take her. But he not say how, not say must kill, just say deal with. You're playing word games with your contract." "Toy playing survival game. Brennan dangerous man. But on dangerous too. Maybe more dangerous because on have nothing lose. Man with nothing lose is man who fight to last breath. Hard to kill, bad risk." Before Gideon could respond, another sound cut through the morning air. A rifle shot, but not from below. From off to the side. The bullet smacked into the tree trunk next to Cutter's head, spraying bark and splinters. Cutter dove for cover instinctively. Gideon rolled in the opposite direction, bringing his own rifle up. For a moment both men were behind cover, neither with a clear shot at the other. Then a voice called out from the trees, old and raspy and familiar. "That's close enough, Cutter. Next one goes through your skull instead of past it." Jack Tanner stepped into view, his own rifle raised, moving with the careful deliberation of an old man who knew better than to rush. His eyes were hard locked on Cutter's position. "Jack," Gideon said, "where the hell did you come from?" "Been following Ong since yesterday. Figured On might need backup. Looks like I figured right." He raised his voice slightly. "Cutter Ann hear me. Toy hear old man." "Good. Because I'm only going to say this once. Whatever Brennan's paying you, it's not enough. Walk away now. Live to track another day. Or stay and find out if on faster than a bullet on can't see coming." Silence. Gideon could hear Cutter breathing behind his cover, could almost hear the calculations running through the tracker's mind. He was outnumbered now. 2 against 1. The tactical advantage had shifted. Finally Cutter spoke. "And right, old man. Not enough money. Not worth die for." There was a rustling sound, then Cutter's voice came from farther away. "But Brennan will ask where Toy go. What Toy see. Toy will tell him truth. Tell him on have help. Tell him on prepared for fight. He will bring more men." "Then let him bring them," Jack called back. "This mountain's got room for plenty of graves." Cutter's laugh echoed through the trees, fading as he moved away. "Toy like an old man, Ann and Mountain Man both. Maybe someday we meet again. Different terms, different job. Until then, on watch back. Brennan not stop. He never stop." Then he was gone. Truly gone. Gideon couldn't hear his footsteps, couldn't sense his presence. The man moved like smoke. Jack lowered his rifle and grinned at Gideon. "Well, that could have gone worse. You saved my life." On would have figured something out. On always do. Jack moved closer, keeping low, mindful of the other riders still searching below. "But I told On yesterday. On not alone anymore. Better get used to it." Gideon started to respond, but movement below caught his eye. Theodore and his men were regrouping, gathering near where Deputy Martin had fallen from his horse. Gideon pulled out his field glasses and focused on the group. Martin was on the ground, and from this distance it looked like he was hurt. The young ranch hand whose horse had reared must have landed wrong. Theodore was kneeling beside him, checking his leg. Even through the glasses, Gideon could see the unnatural angle of Martin's lower leg. Broken. Badly. Theodore stood and barked orders. Two of the men fashioned a makeshift stretcher from branches and rope. They loaded Martin onto it clearly, preparing to carry him back down the mountain. Theodore himself stood apart, staring up at the ridgeline where Gideon had fired from. Even at this distance, even through field glasses, the hatred on his face was visible. A cold, burning rage that promised this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Then Theodore mounted his horse and led his men down the trail, two of them carrying the injured Martin. They retreated in good order, disciplined and controlled, and Gideon knew this was just a tactical withdrawal. They'd be back, with more men, better prepared. Jack sat down on a nearby rock, breathing hard. The exertion of the morning was catching up with him. "Well, we bought some time. Question is what we do with it. We can't stay here. Cutter's right. Brennan won't stop. He'll bring 10 men next time, maybe 20, enough that no amount of clever traps will save us. So we run? No, we prepare. Catherine needs time to heal. The babies need proper care. We gather what we need, then we head for Denver. Put Theodore Brennan in front of a federal judge and let the law handle what violence can't." Jack nodded slowly. "That's the long game. Requires patience. Requires keeping everyone alive for 2, maybe 3 weeks." "I know. And it requires Catherine to be willing to testify, to stand in front of strangers and tell them what her father did. That's not easy, boy. That takes a kind of courage most people don't have. She has it. I saw it in her eyes this morning. She's done running. Then I guess we better make sure she gets the chance to prove it." The two men sat in silence for a moment, listening to the wind move through the pines, watching the distant figures of Theodore's group disappear down the mountain. The first battle was over. They'd won, in a sense. Driven off the attackers kept Catherine and the babies safe. But Gideon knew this was just the beginning, the easy part. Everything that came next would be harder, colder, more dangerous. They'd have to move through hostile territory, avoid Brennan's search parties, keep 2 newborns alive in winter conditions, and somehow get a wounded woman to Denver without her father catching them. The odds weren't good, weren't even close to good. But Gideon had learned something in the past day. Sometimes the odds didn't matter. Sometimes you did what needed doing regardless of whether it made sense. Sometimes courage wasn't about being fearless. It was about being terrified and choosing to act anyway. "Come on," Gideon said, standing. "We need to get back to the cave. Catherine will be worried." As they made their way through the trees, Jack spoke quietly. "What happens if we don't make it, Gideon? If Brennan catches us, if something goes wrong?" "Then we make sure Catherine and those babies survive anyway. We make sure someone tells the truth about Theodore Brennan. We make sure our deaths mean something." "That's a grim way to think about it." "It's a realistic way. I lost my wife and daughter because I wasn't there when it mattered. I won't make that mistake again. Whatever it costs me, Catherine and those babies are going to live. I'll make sure of it." Jack didn't argue. He just nodded and kept walking. When they reached the cave, Gideon called up to the hidden chamber. "Catherine, it's me. It's safe." A long moment passed before he heard movement. Then Catherine's face appeared at the narrow opening, pale and frightened but alive. "I heard shots, multiple shots. I thought you were dead." "Not yet. Come down. We need to talk." It took several minutes to help Catherine and the babies back down into the main cave. She was weaker than she'd been that morning, the stress and fear taking their toll. Gideon settled her by the fire and made her drink water while Jack checked on the infants. "They're hungry," Jack observed. "Really hungry. That pine nut mixture isn't going to sustain them much longer." "I know. I promised Catherine I'd get real milk. Goat milk. There's a homestead half a day from here. Man named Morrison. He owes me a favor." "Half a day there, half a day back. That's a full day you're gone, leaving Catherine alone." "Not alone. You'll be here." Jack raised an eyebrow. "I will, unless you've got somewhere better to be." The old man grinned. "Can't say that I do. All right, I'll stay. Play nursemaid to a wounded woman and 2 screaming infants, living the dream." Catherine spoke up, her voice still rough but stronger than it had been. "What happened out there with my father?" Gideon explained the encounter, the shots, the retreat, the meeting with Silas Cutter. He didn't sugarcoat it, didn't try to make it sound better or worse than it was. Catherine deserved the truth. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "He'll come back. My father. He never gives up, never admits he's wrong. He'll keep hunting us until he finds us or we're dead." "I know." "So what do? We go on a fence. Jack mentioned you might have testimony against your father, things you've seen him do. Is that true?" Catherine's face hardened. "Yes, I've seen him do terrible things. Burned the McAllister ranch when they refused to sell. They lost everything. The father died in the fire. The mother and children barely escaped. Theodore claimed it was an accident. A lantern knocked over. But I saw him that night, saw him ride out with 2 of his men, saw him come back smelling like smoke." "What else?" "A sheep farmer named Chen. He grazed his flock near Theodore's land. Not on it, just near it. Theodore said it was an encroachment, said he had the right to protect his property. He shot Chen in the back while Chen was tending his sheep, called it self-defense. Said Chen had threatened him first. No witnesses, no investigation." Jack leaned forward. "Would you testify to this? In a court of law?" "Yes. If it meant stopping him. If it meant protecting others from what he did to me." "It won't be easy. His lawyers will attack your character. Say you're lying because you're bitter about the discipline he gave you. They'll bring up your pregnancy, your lack of a husband. They'll try to make you look like the villain instead of him. Let them try. I know the truth, and I'm tired of hiding it." Gideon watched her as she spoke, saw the transformation happening in real time. The beaten, broken woman from yesterday was gone. In her place was someone discovering her own strength, her own voice, her own refusal to be silent anymore. "Then that's what we'll do," Gideon said. "We'll gather allies, people who've suffered under Theodore's rule. We'll document everything. Then we'll take it to Denver, to a federal judge who has no reason to protect Theodore Brennan, and we'll make sure the truth gets heard. And if Theodore catches us first, then we make sure the testimony survives even if we don't. We make copies, leave them with people we trust, make sure that no matter what happens, Theodore Brennan's crimes become public knowledge." Catherine nodded slowly. "All right, I'm in, whatever it takes." Jack clapped his hands together. "Well then, sounds like we've got ourselves a plan. Now we just need to survive long enough to execute it. Gideon, go get that milk. These babies aren't going to feed themselves. Catherine and I will hold down the fort here." Gideon hesitated. Leaving felt wrong, dangerous. But Jack was right. The babies needed real food, and soon. "I'll be back by tomorrow morning at the latest. If I'm not assumed something went wrong and head for Bennett's station like I told Catherine before. Nothing's going to go wrong. Now get going." Gideon gathered his pack, checked his rifle, and headed for the cave entrance. As he reached the curtain of laurel, Catherine called out, "Gideon?" He turned. "Thank you. For everything. for saving us, for believing in us, for not walking away when you had every reason to. I had every reason to help. Just took me 7 years to remember that. Then he was gone, slipping out into the cold afternoon air, leaving Jack and Catherine and the babies behind in a cave that suddenly felt more like home than anywhere he'd lived in years. The journey to Morrison's homestead took 6 hours of hard travel through terrain that would have killed most men. Gideon moved with the efficiency of someone who knew every rock and tree, cutting through narrow valleys and across exposed ridges where the wind cut like knives. By the time he reached Morrison's place, the sun was setting and his breath came in clouds. Morrison himself was a surprise. Gideon had traded with the man dozens of times over the years, but he'd never known much about him beyond the basics. 50 years old, maybe. A homesteader who kept to himself, raised goats, traded milk and cheese for meat and furs. But when Gideon explained what he needed and why, Morrison's face went carefully blank. "Theodore Brennan's daughter," Morrison said slowly. "You're protecting her from him." "That's right." "And you need goat milk for her babies." "Yes." Morrison was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I knew Theodore Brennan years ago, before he became what he is now. We served together in the war, watched each other's backs, saved each other's lives more than once." Gideon felt his stomach sink. If Morrison was loyal to Theodore, this whole trip had been for nothing. But then Morrison continued. He was a good man back then, fair, honest, brave. But something broke in him during the war, something that never quite healed. By the time we mustered out, he was different, harder, meaner, like he'd used up all his compassion on the battlefield and had none left for civilian life. "So will you help me or not?" "I'll help you. Not because I hate Theodore, but because I remember what he used to be. And I know he'd be ashamed of what he's become. A man who beats his own daughter isn't a man anymore. He's just violence wearing a man's face." Morrison went to his goat pen and selected a young nanny, cream-colored and docile. He put a rope around her neck and handed it to Gideon. "Take her. She's yours. Gives about a quart of milk a day. More if you feed her right. Should be enough to keep 2 babies alive through the winter." "I can't pay you for this. Not what she's worth." "Didn't ask you to. Consider it a debt paid. Theodore saved my life once. Now I'm saving his grandchildren. We're even." Gideon started to leave, then turned back. "Morrison, if Theodore comes asking questions, tells you I stole from you, threatens you, anything like that, you tell him the truth. Don't protect me. Don't risk yourself." Morrison smiled grimly. "Son, I've faced down Confederate cavalry charges and Apache war parties. I'm not afraid of Theodore Brennan, but I appreciate the concern." The journey back took longer than Gideon expected. The goat was cooperative but slow, unused to mountain travel, and Gideon had to stop frequently to let her rest. It was well past midnight by the time he finally made it back to the area around the cave, and he was exhausted. That's when he smelled it. Smoke. Too much smoke. Not the small, controlled fire of a cooking pit. The thick, acrid smell of something burning that shouldn't be. Gideon dropped the goat's rope and ran, his exhaustion forgotten, his heart pounding with fear. As he got closer to the cave, he could see orange light flickering through the trees. Fire. The cave was on fire. He burst through the laurel curtain and into chaos. The cave was full of smoke, thick and choking. Jack was on the ground unconscious, or dead, blood streaming from a gash on his head. Catherine was backed into a corner, clutching the babies, her eyes wide with terror. And standing in the entrance, blocking the only exit, was a man Gideon had never seen before. Tall, lean, dressed in dark clothes, with a cruel smile and a pistol in his hand. "Gideon Reed," the man said, his voice smooth and cultured, nothing like the rough speech of a ranch hand. "I've heard so much about you. Theodore Brennan sends his regards." The man raised his pistol and fired. The bullet that should have killed Gideon Reed instead tore through the thick leather of his coat and grazed his ribs, spinning him sideways and dropping him to his knees. Pain exploded across his side, white-hot and immediate, but his mind was already moving, calculating, surviving. The smoke in the cave was thick enough to obscure vision, and the stranger's second shot went wide, punching into the cave wall and sending rock chips flying. Gideon rolled left behind the natural stone shelf where he kept his supplies, his hand reaching for the bowie knife at his belt. The rifle was too long for this space, too unwieldy. This would be close work. Brutal work. The kind of fighting he'd learned in the war when ammunition ran out and survival came down to who was willing to be more vicious. "Not so easy when someone shoots back, is it?" The stranger called out, his cultured voice oddly cheerful despite the violence. "Theodore said you were supposed to be dangerous, some kind of legendary mountain man. But you look pretty ordinary to me, bleeding on the ground like that." Catherine's voice cut through the smoke, raw and defiant. "Get out. Leave us alone." "I'm afraid I can't do that, Miss Brennan. Your father's orders were quite specific. Bring you home. Deal with anyone protecting you, permanently." The man's footsteps moved closer. "Though I must say I'm curious why you'd throw your lot in with this hermit. Surely you could have found better help than a man who's been hiding from the world for 7 years. Gideon's hand closed around something on the shelf. Not a weapon. Better. A small clay pot containing the pepper powder his grandmother had taught him to make. Ground dried chilies mixed with ash. Thrown in someone's face, it was more effective than any punch. "You talk too much," Gideon said, his voice steady despite the pain. "Men who talk that much in a fight usually don't survive them." "Is that so? Well then, let me remedy my verbosity with action." The stranger fired again, but Gideon was already moving. He hurled the pepper pot at where he estimated the man's face to be heard. Its shatter heard the immediate howl of pain as the powder found its mark. Then he was up and charging through the smoke knife, leading, aiming for where the sound came from. He collided with the stranger, drove him backward toward the cave entrance. The man was strong, well-trained, recovering from the pepper attack faster than most would have. He got an arm up, blocked Gideon's knife thrust, countered with a punch that caught Gideon in the already wounded ribs. Pain flared and Gideon's vision went gray for a moment, but a moment was all the stranger needed. He twisted free, stumbled out through the laurel curtain, and was gone into the darkness before Gideon could follow. Gideon wanted to give chase. Every instinct screamed at him to finish this, to hunt the man down and make sure he could never threaten Catherine again. But Catherine's voice, choked with smoke and fear, pulled him back. "Gideon, Jack's hurt. The babies are barely breathing." Gideon turned back to the cave. The fire was small, contained to a pile of kindling near the entrance, meant to smoke them out, not burn them alive, probably so the stranger could pick them off as they fled. Gideon kicked the burning wood apart, smothered it with his coat, then turned his attention to Jack. The old man was unconscious, a nasty gash above his left temple where something heavy had struck him. His pulse was weak but steady. Gideon lifted him in a fireman's carry and moved him outside, laying him gently on the cold ground where the fresh air might revive him. Then he went back for Catherine and the babies. The smoke was clearing now, but both infants were barely conscious, their lips tinged blue, their breathing shallow and rapid. Smoke inhalation, potentially fatal in children so young. "We need to get them into clean air," Gideon said, taking one baby while Catherine clutched the other. "Follow me." He led them 50 yards from the cave to a sheltered spot between two boulders. The night air was brutally cold, well below freezing, but it was clean. That mattered more right now than warmth. Gideon worked quickly, drawing on half-remembered medical training from the war. He held each baby upside down for a few seconds, letting gravity help clear their airways, rubbed their backs, stimulating breathing reflexes. Breathed gently into their tiny mouths, not forcing air, but encouraging their lungs to remember their job. Slowly, painfully, slowly, color began returning to their faces. Their cries grew stronger. Catherine sobbed with relief, clutching her children to her chest, rocking them in the darkness. "Who was that man?" she asked when she could speak again. "He wasn't one of my father's regular men. He spoke like an educated person, like someone from back east." "Hired gun," Gideon said, checking on Jack. The old man was starting to stir, groaning softly. "Your father must have sent for him when the local men failed. Professional killer, someone who makes violence into an art form. Will he come back?" "Yes, but not tonight. I hurt him. That pepper will have him half-blind for hours, and his pride is wounded worse than his eyes. He'll need time to recover, to plan. Tomorrow at the earliest." Jack's eyes opened. For a moment they were unfocused, confused. Then clarity returned, and he tried to sit up too quickly, immediately regretting it as pain lanced through his skull. "Easy," Gideon said, supporting him. "You took a bad hit. Tell me something I don't know." Jack touched his head, winced at the blood. "Bastard came out of nowhere. Said he was looking for Theodore Brennan's daughter. Said Theodore sent him to bring her home. I told him she wasn't here, played dumb, but he wasn't buying it. Hit me with his pistol butt before I could draw my own weapon. He's gone now, for the moment. What about the cave?" "Compromised. We can't stay here. He knows where it is, knows we're vulnerable. We need to move, tonight." Catherine's voice was small, frightened, in a way it hadn't been even when her father was beating her. "Gideon, the babies can barely breathe. I can barely walk. Jack's injured. How can we possibly move in the middle of the night with a professional killer hunting us? Because staying here means dying here. And I didn't pull you out of that dirt to watch you die in this cave." The hardness in his voice wasn't anger, it was determination. The kind that came from having lost everything once and refusing to let it happen again. Catherine heard it, understood it, and nodded. "Tell me what to do." Over the next hour, working by moonlight and the occasional flicker of a small shielded fire, Gideon organized their retreat. He salvaged what he could from the cave: blankets, food, medical supplies, ammunition. The most important items got packed into 2 large bundles that could be carried. Everything else got cached in the hidden upper chamber, buried under loose rock, where it might be found later if they survived to return. The goat Morrison had given him was still tethered where Gideon had dropped her rope. Remarkably calm despite the chaos, she allowed herself to be loaded with one of the packs. The other pack went on Gideon's back. Jack, still unsteady but able to walk, carried his rifle and supported Catherine. The babies went into a sling Catherine wore bound tight against her body for warmth. They moved slowly, painfully through terrain that would have been challenging in daylight and was treacherous in darkness. Gideon led with his rifle ready, scanning constantly for threats. Jack brought up the rear, watching their back trail. Catherine walked between them, every step an act of will, her face set in lines of determination that made her look years older than her 22 years. By dawn, they'd covered perhaps 3 miles. Under normal circumstances, it would have been pathetic progress. But given their condition, their burdens, and the fact that they'd all nearly died in the past 12 hours, it was a miracle they'd moved at all. Gideon called a halt in a dense grove of pines that offered concealment and some shelter from the wind. He milked the goat, producing about a cup of warm, rich liquid that the babies drank greedily. Then he insisted Catherine drink what was left, knowing she needed calories to produce her own milk to keep her strength up to survive. While Catherine fed the babies and Jack dozed against a tree trunk, Gideon climbed to a nearby outcropping and glassed their back trail with his field glasses. Nothing moved, no sign of pursuit. But that didn't mean they were safe. It just meant their enemies weren't visible yet. As he watched the distant mountains, another figure materialized beside him with such silence that Gideon's hand went to his knife before he recognized the visitor. Silas Cutter stood there, arms crossed, his dark eyes studying Gideon with something that might have been respect. "On still alive," Cutter observed. "Good. Would be shame if hired gun kill on. Take away my chance. You here to finish what he started. Toy here because job get interesting. Brennan hire new man. Professional from Denver. Man named Dalton Cross. Very expensive. Very good at killing. This change things." "How?" "Brennan desperate. Bring in Cross. Mean he not care about cost anymore. Not care about being careful. He want daughter back and want and dead, and he not stop until one or both happen. I already knew that. But on not no rest. Cross not work alone. He bring 3 more men with him, all professional, all killers. So now not 5 ranch hands with rifles. Now 5 trained killers plus Brennan plus his ranch hands. Maybe 12 men total, all hunting Ankh." Gideon felt his stomach tighten. The situation had just gone from dangerous to nearly impossible. Why are you telling me this?" Cutter was silent for a moment, looking out at the mountains. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, more personal than the stilted pronouns he usually used. "My mother was Apache. White soldiers killed her when I was 10. Not because she did anything wrong, just because she was there. They laughed about it after, said one less savage in the world." He turned to look at Gideon directly. "I see Catherine Brennan's back. See what father do to her. Remind me of my mother. What men do to women when they have power and no conscience. I not like that, not honor that kind of fighting. So you're switching sides. I not fight for Aunt, but I not fight against Ong either. I walk away, lose $50, but keep honor, keep ability to look at self in mirror. Brennan will be angry. Let him be angry. He angry man anyway. One more thing not make difference." Cutter started to leave, then paused. "One more thing. Cross is good, but he have weakness. He proud. Think he best. If on make him angry, make him personal, he make mistake. Use that." Then he was gone, disappearing into the trees as silently as he'd arrived. Gideon returned to the others and explained what Cutter had told him. Jack's face went grim. Catherine's hand tightened on her babies. 12 men, Jack said. Professional killers. We can't fight that. Not with a wounded woman, 2 infants, and an old man with a concussion. We're not going to fight them. We're going to outrun them, and we're going to get help. Help from who? Everyone in Silver Pine is afraid of Theodore. Not everyone. You told me there were others who'd suffered under him. The McAllisters lost their ranch. The Chen family lost their father. There must be others. People who'd testify if they knew someone was finally willing to stand up to Theodore Brennan. Catherine spoke up, her voice stronger than it had been. The widow Hayes. Her husband died in suspicious circumstances 3 years ago. Fell off a cliff while riding Theodore's property line. Everyone said accident, but Martha Hayes always believed Theodore's men pushed him because he'd seen something he shouldn't have. Where does she live? 10 miles north, in the foothills. She runs a boarding house now. Then that's where we go. We gather allies, people willing to testify, people willing to stand witness, and then we make for Denver with enough testimony to bury Theodore Brennan under his own crimes. Jack shook his head slowly. Boy, that's a 3-week journey in good conditions. With winter coming on and Theodore hunting us, we'll never make it. Maybe not. But staying here means dying here. At least this way we die trying to do something that matters. They rested for 2 hours, taking turns on watch, then continued north. The terrain grew gradually easier as they descended from the high peaks, trading altitude for tree cover, rocky slopes for forested valleys. The weather held cold, but clear, and the babies seemed to adapt to the constant motion, sleeping more peacefully in their sling than they had in the cave. By late afternoon they could see smoke rising from chimneys in the distance. A small cluster of buildings that marked Martha Hayes' boarding house and the tiny community that had grown around it. Wait here, Gideon said. Stay hidden. I'll go ahead, make sure it's safe. And if it's not? Catherine asked. Then you hear gunfire and you run. North. Don't stop. Make for Bennett's Station like I told you before. Gideon, I can't keep running forever. None of us can. Then let's hope it's safe. He approached the boarding house carefully, rifle ready, every sense alert for ambush, but the place seemed quiet, peaceful. A woman in her 40s was hanging laundry despite the cold, her breath fogging in the air. She looked up as Gideon emerged from the tree line, tensed for a moment, then relaxed slightly when she saw he was alone. Help you, she called out, her voice cautious but not unfriendly. I'm looking for Martha Hayes. You found her. Who's asking? Gideon Reed. Jack Tanner sent me. Said you might be willing to help someone Theodore Brennan has wronged. Martha's face changed at Theodore's name. Something hard and bitter crossed her features. Come closer where I can see you proper. Gideon did. Martha studied him with sharp eyes, taking in his worn clothes, his obvious exhaustion, the blood stain on his side where the bullet had grazed him. You're hurt. I'll live. You alone? No, I have others with me. Catherine Brennan, Theodore's daughter, and 2 infants. Catherine's children. Martha's eyes widened. Catherine. But Theodore said she ran off with some drifter, said she abandoned her responsibilities, said she was dead to him. Theodore lied. He beat her nearly to death because she got pregnant out of wedlock. I found her in the dirt with her babies and saved her. Now he's hunting us with professional killers because he can't stand the idea that someone stood up to him. Martha was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "My husband Benjamin died 3 years ago. Fell off a cliff on Theodore's land. Everyone said accident, but Ben was the best horseman in the county. He didn't just fall. And the night before he died, he told me he'd seen something. Theodore's men moving stolen cattle at night, rebranding them. Ben was going to report it to the marshal in Denver, and Theodore had him killed. I've always believed it, but I had no proof, no witnesses, and I was a woman alone with 2 children to raise. I couldn't risk speaking out. And now my children are grown and gone. Now I've spent 3 years thinking about Ben every day and wondering if keeping silent made me complicit in his murder. Now someone's finally standing up to that bastard." She set down her laundry basket. "Bring your people here. I'll help. Whatever you need." Gideon signaled to the tree line. Jack appeared first, supporting Catherine, who looked ready to collapse. Then came the goat, placid and patient, and finally the babies in their sling, somehow still sleeping despite everything. Martha took one look at Catherine's condition and went into action. She helped her inside, settled her in a warm bed, checked her wounds with the practiced hands of someone who'd done field medicine before. The babies got cow's milk from Martha's own stock, warmed and sweetened slightly, and they drank like they'd never tasted anything so good. While Catherine rested, Martha, Jack, and Gideon sat around her kitchen table and planned. "If you want to bring Theodore down, you need more than my testimony," Martha said. "You need documents, records, physical evidence, the kind of thing a judge can't ignore." The next morning, Catherine found Gideon outside the boarding house preparing to scout the perimeter. She was moving better now, her wounds healing, but each step still brought a wince of pain. "I'm coming with you," she said, her voice firm. Gideon turned surprised. "You need rest. Your back isn't healed yet." "My back will heal, but I can't stay hidden while you risk everything. I need to learn to defend myself, to defend my children." "Catherine, you're barely able to walk. If something happens—" "Then what?" Her voice rose, frustration breaking through. "You'll have failed again. Is that what this is really about, Gideon? You're not protecting me because you care about me. You're protecting me because you're trying to redeem yourself, trying to fix what happened with Sarah and Anna." The words struck like a physical blow. Gideon's face hardened. "That's not fair." "Isn't it?" Catherine stepped closer despite the pain. "You make every decision. You won't let me have a voice in my own survival. You keep me at arm's length like I'm something fragile that might shatter. How is that different from what my father did? He controlled me too. He decided what was best for me too." Gideon's eyes flashed. "I am nothing like your father." "Then prove it." Catherine's voice cracked. "Teach me. Trust me. Stop treating me like I'm someone who needs saving, and start treating me like I'm someone who can stand beside you." The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken things. Finally, Gideon let out a long breath, and something in his expression softened. "You're right," he said quietly. "I've been so focused on not failing again that I forgot something important. You're not someone who needs saving, Catherine. You already saved yourself when you refused to let your father break you. You just needed someone willing to stand beside you while you did it." Catherine's anger faded. "That's all I'm asking. To be your partner, not your responsibility." Gideon pulled his spare pistol from his belt and offered it to her. "All right. Then let's start with basic shooting. But if you ever tell Jack I admitted I was wrong, I'll deny it to my grave." Despite everything, Catherine smiled. "Deal." While Catherine rested after the lesson, Martha, Jack, and Gideon sat around her kitchen table and planned. "Where would we find that?" Gideon asked. "Theodore's ranch. His study. He keeps books on everything. Every land deal, every business transaction, every employee on his payroll. If he's been doing illegal things, and we all know he has, there'll be evidence in those books. His ranch is 20 miles from here, through open country. We'd never get close without being seen. Not we. Me. Martha's voice was firm. Theodore doesn't see me as a threat. I'm just the widow Hayes who runs a boarding house. I could ride over, claim I'm looking for work for one of my lodgers, ask to speak with his foreman. While I'm there, I slip into his study. 5 minutes. That's all I'd need. It's too dangerous, Jack said. If he catches you, then he catches me. But I've been playing it safe for 3 years and it hasn't brought Ben justice. Maybe it's time I took a risk. Before anyone could argue further, there was a knock at the door. Everyone froze. Gideon's hand went to his rifle. Martha stood and moved to the window, peeked out carefully. "It's Billy Chen," she said, surprised. "The sheep farmer's son." She opened the door. A young man, perhaps 22, Chinese features and nervous eyes, stood there looking over his shoulder like he expected someone to follow him. "Mrs. Hayes, I heard you had visitors. Is it true? Is Catherine Brennan here?" "Who told you that?" "Word travels. People talk, and I need to talk to her, to whoever's helping her. I have something important." Martha let him in. Billy Chen stood in the kitchen, his hands shaking slightly, and pulled a folded document from inside his coat. "My father kept this, before Theodore Brennan killed him. It's a map. Shows all the land Theodore's stolen over the past 10 years. Every illegal fence line, every property marker he moved, every water right he claimed that wasn't his. My father documented everything. He was going to take it to the federal marshal. But Theodore found out, killed him before he could." He laid the map on the table. It was detailed, meticulous, showing property boundaries and discrepancies that told a story of systematic theft. Billy hesitated, his hands still trembling as he stared at the map. "There's something else, something I haven't told anyone." The room went quiet. Martha leaned forward. "What is it, Billy?" He took a shaky breath. "Theodore didn't just kill my father. He forced me to help him. Threatened to burn down our home with my mother and sisters inside if I didn't cooperate. His voice broke. "I helped him move my father's body, made it look like he'd fallen while herding sheep. I've been living with that guilt for 3 years." Silence filled the kitchen. Catherine, who had appeared in the doorway, spoke first. "You were protecting your family." "That doesn't make it right," Billy said, tears streaming down his face. "I helped cover up my own father's murder. What kind of son does that?" "The kind who had impossible choices," Gideon said quietly. "Theodore's good at that, making people choose between terrible options. But you're here now. You're telling the truth. That takes more courage than most men have." Billy looked up, his eyes red. "If I testify, I'll have to admit what I did. I could go to prison." "Maybe," Gideon said. "But you'll be free. Really free. For the first time in 3 years." Billy nodded slowly, wiping his eyes. "Then I'll testify, all of it, even the parts that damn me." "Why didn't you take this to the law yourself?" Gideon asked. He laid the map on the table. It was detailed, meticulous, showing property boundaries and discrepancies that told a story of systematic theft. "Why didn't you take this to the law yourself?" Gideon asked. "Because I was afraid. Because I'm Chinese and Theodore is powerful, and who would believe me? But if Catherine testifies, if Martha testifies, if there are multiple voices saying the same thing, maybe someone will listen. Maybe my father's death will mean something." Gideon looked at the 3 of them. Martha Hayes with her husband's ghost. Billy Chen with his father's murder unavenged. Catherine sleeping in the next room with her mother's death and her own suffering. And himself carrying 7 years of guilt for a family he couldn't save. They were all broken people, all carrying losses that couldn't be undone. But maybe together they could create something that mattered, something that turned private grief into public justice. "All right," Gideon said. "Here's what we do. Martha, you make that visit to Theodore's ranch tomorrow. Billy, you spread the word. Anyone else who suffered under Theodore's rule, anyone willing to testify, they come here. We gather evidence, gather witnesses, and in 3 days we start for Denver. All of us together. Safety in numbers." "And what about Cross?" Jack asked. "The professional killer. He's not going to wait 3 days. Then we make him come to us, on our terms, in a place we choose, where the advantage is ours." "How?" Gideon smiled grimly. "We bait him. Make him angry like Cutter said, make it personal, and when he comes, we're ready." Over the next 2 days, Martha Hayes' boarding house transformed into something between a war council and a sanctuary. People started arriving. Not many, and none of them particularly impressive at first glance, but each one carried a story, a piece of Theodore Brennan's history of violence and corruption. There was Samuel Wright, a former ranch hand who'd witnessed Theodore beating a Mexican worker to death for stealing food. There was Elizabeth Porter, whose father had lost his mining claim when Theodore produced a forged document claiming ownership. There was Thomas Gray, a former sheriff who'd been forced to resign when he tried to investigate Theodore for cattle rustling. Each person added their voice to the growing chorus. Each one brought documents, letters, testimonies. The evidence piled up undeniable and damning. And Catherine, recovering slowly in Martha's care, listened to each story and realized she wasn't alone, that her suffering wasn't unique or isolated, that Theodore Brennan had been destroying lives for years and she was just one more victim in a long line of them. On the second night, Martha returned from Theodore's ranch with something precious. A ledger book stolen from his study with 5 minutes of careful work and nerves of steel. The ledger showed payments to men for special services on dates that corresponded with mysterious deaths and accidents. It showed land purchases at prices far below market value, suggesting intimidation or fraud. It showed everything a federal prosecutor would need to build a case. "He'll know it's missing," Martha said, setting the ledger on the table. "He keeps meticulous records. He'll realize it's gone, and he'll know someone was in his study." "Good," Gideon said. "Let him know. Let him get angry. Let him make a mistake." The mistake came that night. Dalton Cross, the professional killer Theodore had hired, made his move. But he didn't come alone. He brought his 3 associates and 4 of Theodore's best men. 8 attackers total, arriving just after midnight, thinking they'd catch everyone sleeping. But Gideon had anticipated this, had prepared for it. The boarding house sat at the edge of a clearing with good sight lines in all directions. He'd positioned lookouts in the surrounding trees, had prepared defensive positions inside, had even rigged simple traps, tripwires connected to pots and pans that would make noise if disturbed. The first alarm went up at 12:15. One of the lookouts, Samuel Wright, saw movement and whistled the warning. Gideon was up immediately, rifle in hand, moving to the window. 8 men approached the house in a loose skirmish line. Professional, disciplined, spread out enough that one shot couldn't take multiple targets. They carried rifles and pistols, and the moonlight glinted off their weapons. Dalton Cross led from the center. Even at this distance, Gideon could recognize him. Tall, lean, moving with the confidence of someone who'd never lost a fight. Gideon opened the window and called out, "That's far enough, Cross. You're on private property. Turn around and leave." Cross stopped but didn't retreat. "Gideon Reed, we keep meeting under such unpleasant circumstances. I really must insist you hand over Catherine Brennan. Her father's quite anxious to see her." "Her father's anxious to kill her. There's a difference." "Semantics. Either way, I'm being paid to retrieve her, and I always complete my contracts. Even when the contract is wrong, when you're being paid to help a man abuse his own daughter. I'm not paid to make moral judgments, Mr. Reed. I'm paid to solve problems. And you, sir, are a problem." Gideon raised his rifle and fired, not at Cross but at the ground 2 feet in front of him. The bullet kicked up snow and dirt, making Cross flinch backward. "That was a warning," Gideon called out. "The next one won't be." Cross's expression changed. The cultured amusement disappeared, replaced by cold anger. "You just made this personal, Reed. That was a mistake." "Good. I was hoping you'd take it that way." Cross raised his hand and his men opened fire. Bullets punched through the windows, thudded into the wooden walls, sent everyone inside diving for cover. But the defensive positions Gideon had prepared held. The furniture they'd stacked, the interior walls they'd reinforced with spare lumber, the firing slits they'd cut in the shutters. All of it worked together to turn the boarding house into a fortress. Gideon returned fire, not aiming to kill, but to suppress, to keep Cross's men pinned down and unable to advance. Jack covered the back of the house. Billy Chin and Thomas Gray, neither of them soldiers, but both of them willing, covered the sides. The firefight lasted 20 minutes. Bullets flew, powder smoke filled the air. The noise was deafening. But when it was over, Cross's men pulled back. One of them was wounded, clutching his shoulder where Gideon's bullet had found its mark. The others were unharmed but frustrated, unable to breach the house's defenses. Cross himself stood at the edge of the clearing, staring at the house with an expression of pure fury. Then he turned and led his men away, disappearing into the darkness. Inside the house, everyone took stock. No one seriously injured. Some close calls, some near misses, but they'd held. They'd survived. "He'll be back," Jack said, reloading his rifle. "And next time he'll be smarter, more careful." "I'm counting on it," Gideon said. The third day dawned clear and cold. Gideon stood at the window watching the approaches when Jack joined him. "Been thinking," the old man said, "about what happens after Denver, after we testify, after Theodore gets what's coming to him. What about it? What happens to you and Catherine, to those babies?" "I don't know. Haven't thought that far ahead." "Liar. You think about it every time you look at her. Every time you feed those infants. You think about whether you could be a father again, whether you deserve another chance after losing Anna." Gideon was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "I lost Sarah and Anna because I wasn't there when they needed me. Every day for 7 years I've carried that guilt. Told myself I didn't deserve happiness, didn't deserve a family, didn't deserve anything except the cold and the solitude and the memory of what I'd lost. And now I'm starting to think maybe I was wrong. Maybe the way to honor Sarah and Anna isn't to punish myself forever. Maybe it's to protect someone else, to be there when it matters, to not make the same mistake twice." Jack clapped him on the shoulder. "She cares for you, you know. Catherine, I see the way she looks at you when you're not watching, like you're the first person in her life who ever chose to stand beside her instead of over her. She's been through hell. She doesn't need me complicating things." "Son, you already complicated things the moment you pulled her out of that dirt. Might as well see it through." That afternoon, Theodore Brennan himself arrived. He came with a white flag, riding alone up to the boarding house, his face a mask of controlled rage. Gideon stepped out to meet him, rifle held loosely but ready. Behind him, Catherine appeared in the doorway, the babies in her arms. Theodore's eyes fixed on her, and for a moment something passed across his face. Pain, maybe, or regret. But it was gone so fast, Gideon might have imagined it. "I want to talk to my daughter," Theodore said. "Talk," Gideon replied. "I'm listening too." Theodore ignored him, focusing entirely on Catherine. "This stops now. You come home. We put this behind us. The babies can stay if you insist, though. I think it's better if they're given to a church orphanage. We tell everyone you were sick, that you needed time to recover. No one needs to know what happened." Catherine's voice was steady when she replied, "No. Catherine, be reasonable. This man has poisoned your mind, made you think I'm some kind of monster. I was trying to teach you, to make you understand the gravity of what you'd done. You beat me until I couldn't stand. You left me to die in the cold. You told me my babies were bastards and better off dead. That's not teaching, Father. That's torture. I was angry, grief-stricken over your mother. I went too far, I admit that. But I'm your father. I deserve a chance to make this right." "You had that chance. Every day for 22 years you had that chance. You could have been kind, patient, understanding. Instead you were violent, controlling, cruel. Not just to me, to everyone who crossed you. I know what you did to the McAllisters, to the Chen family, to the widow Hayes's husband. I know, and I'm going to tell everyone." Theodore's face hardened. "If you testify against me, you destroy our family name, everything your mother and I built, everything we worked for. You destroyed it yourself. I'm just making sure everyone knows the truth." Theodore turned to Gideon. "I'll pay you. $20,000. Walk away. Forget you ever met her. Let me handle my family affairs." Your family affairs include beating women and murdering men who inconvenience you. I'm not interested in money from someone like that. Then what do you want? Justice, revenge? Tell me what it takes. It takes you in a courtroom, answering for everything you've done. It takes you in prison. It takes your power broken and your victims freed. Theodore's expression went cold. Then you've chosen death. Cross will kill you. If not him, someone else. I have unlimited resources and you have nothing. You can't win this. Maybe not, but I can make sure you lose. Theodore wheeled his horse around and rode away. The white flag of truce was forgotten. War had been declared and everyone knew it. That night they prepared to leave for Denver. The journey would take 2 weeks minimum through dangerous country, with Theodore's men hunting them every step of the way. But they had 12 witnesses now. They had documents. They had evidence. And they had something Theodore Brennan had lost years ago. They had the moral certainty that what they were doing was right. As they loaded the wagons and prepared the horses, Gideon found Catherine standing alone, looking at the mountains where her father's ranch lay hidden. "Regrets?" he asked. "No. Fear, yes. Doubt sometimes. But not regret. I'm doing the right thing. For me, for my children, for everyone he's hurt. Your father was right about one thing. This will destroy your family name. The Brennans will be synonymous with corruption and violence. Then maybe it's time for a new name. Maybe it's time to be something other than a Brennan." She turned to look at him, and in the moonlight, Gideon saw the same determination he'd seen that first day. The refusal to break. The strength that had carried her through beatings and abandonment and everything else life had thrown at her. "When this is over," she said quietly, "when we've testified and Theodore faces justice, I want to start fresh, build something new. Raise my children somewhere they don't have to carry the weight of what their grandfather did." "That sounds like a good plan. I was hoping you might be part of it, if you wanted to be." Gideon's breath caught. He'd been thinking the same thing but hadn't dared to hope she felt it too. "Catherine, I'm twice your age. I'm a man who's been hiding from the world for 7 years. I have nothing to offer you except protection and probably a life of hardship. You have everything to offer me. You have kindness, courage, the willingness to stand up for what's right even when it costs you. That's more than most men can claim. I lost a family once. Lost them because I wasn't there when they needed me. I'm terrified of failing again." "Then don't fail. Be there. That's all I'm asking. Not perfection, just presence." Gideon reached out and took her hand, his rough palm against her soft skin, and something in his chest loosened. A knot of guilt and grief and self-imposed isolation that had been tied there for 7 years finally began to unwind. "All right," he said. "I'll be there." She smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her, and it transformed her face, made her look young again, hopeful again, like someone who could imagine a future instead of just surviving a present. The journey to Denver was everything Gideon expected, and worse. They traveled in 2 wagons, surrounded by armed escorts moving as fast as the terrain allowed. Theodore's men harassed them constantly. Shots from distant ridgelines, ambushes on narrow trails, night raids that forced them to maintain constant vigilance. On the 4th day, they lost Thomas Gray. A bullet from a hidden sniper found him while he was scouting ahead, and he died before they could get him medical attention. They buried him in a shallow grave and kept moving, knowing that stopping meant dying. On the 8th day, they crossed paths with a federal marshal traveling from Denver. Billy Chin flagged him down, showed him the evidence they'd gathered, explained where they were going and why. The marshal, a hard-eyed man named Samuel Cooper, listened carefully, then made a decision. But Theodore Brennan wasn't done yet. On the 10th day, he made his final play. They were crossing a narrow mountain pass when Theodore and 10 men blocked the trail ahead. Behind them, Dalton Cross emerged with 5 more. They were trapped. Theodore sat on his horse rifle across his saddle, his face carved from stone. "This is your last chance, Catherine. Come home, now, or everyone with you dies." Marshal Cooper stepped forward. "Theodore Brennan, I'm a federal marshal. Stand down or you'll be adding assaulting a lawman to your charges." Theodore's laugh was bitter. You think I care about charges? I'm already ruined. My daughter's destroyed everything. The least I can do is take her betrayers with me. Gideon moved to stand beside Catherine, rifle ready. Jack on her other side. Martha, Billy, Samuel, Elizabeth, all of them forming a line. Then you'll have to go through all of us, Gideon said quietly. Theodore raised his rifle. For one endless moment, the mountains held their breath. Then Samuel Wright, the former ranch hand, stepped out from Theodore's line. He lowered his weapon. No, Mr. Brennan, I won't shoot innocent people, not anymore. Another man followed, then another. Within moments, half of Theodore's men had lowered their weapons, stepping away from their employer. Theodore's face went white with rage. Traitors! All of you! Not traitors, Samuel said. Just men who finally found the courage to do what's right. Theodore stared at his daughter one last time. Then he wheeled his horse around and rode away, Dalton Cross and the few loyal men following. The man who'd ruled through fear had been defeated not by violence, but by the simple refusal of good people to follow evil orders. Marshal Cooper watched them go. Should we pursue? No need, Gideon said. He'll be in Denver. He won't run. His pride won't let him. And he was right. When they reached Denver 2 days later, Theodore Brennan was already there waiting for his trial, convinced to the last that he was the righteous one. I'm going to escort you myself. What you're describing is federal crimes, systematic corruption, murder, theft. If even half of what you're saying is true, Theodore Brennan needs to be in prison. Having a federal marshal with them changed everything. Theodore's men backed off, unwilling to attack a lawman. Dalton Cross disappeared entirely, his contract apparently not extending to fighting federal authorities. The last week of the journey was quiet, almost peaceful, though no one let their guard down entirely. They reached Denver on the 20th day. The city was bigger than anything Catherine had ever seen, full of noise and people and buildings that seemed impossibly tall. But it also represented something she'd never expected to have: safety, justice, hope. The federal courthouse was an imposing stone structure in the heart of the city. Judge Harrison Whitmore, a stern man in his 60s with a reputation for fairness, heard their case in his chambers before agreeing to a formal trial. "This is serious," he said, looking at the evidence spread across his desk. "If what you're alleging is true, Theodore Brennan has committed crimes that deserve decades in prison. But I need you to understand something. A trial like this will be ugly. His lawyers will attack every one of you, question your motives, your credibility, your character. Are you prepared for that?" Catherine stood. "Your Honor, Theodore Brennan beat me nearly to death because I got pregnant. He murdered men who opposed him. He stole land and livelihoods and destroyed families. If telling the truth about that means people attack my character, then so be it. At least I'll be able to look at myself in the mirror." Judge Whitmore studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right. We'll convene the trial in 3 days. That gives both sides time to prepare. Marshal Cooper, I want Theodore Brennan arrested and brought to Denver immediately." "Yes, Your Honor." The trial lasted 2 weeks. Theodore's lawyers were good expensive, bringing in character witnesses and questioning every piece of evidence. But the sheer volume of testimony against him was overwhelming. Witness after witness took the stand. Catherine described her beating. Martha Hayes described her husband's suspicious death. Billy Chen presented his father's map. Elizabeth Porter showed forged documents. Samuel Wright testified about the murder he'd witnessed. And through it all, Theodore sat at the defense table, his face a mask of arrogance and barely contained fury. He never showed remorse, never apologized. Even when the evidence mounted to the point where his guilt was undeniable, he maintained his righteousness, insisted he'd done what was necessary, that he'd been protecting his property, his family, his honor. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood and read the verdict. "On the charge of murder in the first degree of Benjamin Hayes, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of murder in the first degree of Chen Wei, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of fraud, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of attempted murder of Catherine Brennan, we find the defendant guilty." The list went on. 18 charges. Guilty on all of them. Judge Whitmore sentenced Theodore Brennan to life in prison without possibility of parole. The man who'd ruled half a valley through fear and violence would spend the rest of his days in a cell, his power broken, his crimes exposed. As they led him away in chains, Theodore looked at Catherine one last time. There was no love in his eyes, no regret, just hatred and the bitter satisfaction of a man who'd convinced himself he was the victim. Catherine looked back unflinching. Then she turned away, took her babies in her arms, and walked out of the courthouse into the spring sunshine. Gideon was waiting outside. He'd testified earlier in the trial and had been excused, but he'd stayed close knowing Catherine would need support. When she emerged, he could see the weight lifting from her shoulders, the fear and tension that had defined her for so long finally releasing. "It's over," she said, her voice full of wonder. "He can't hurt anyone anymore." "No, he can't. You made sure of that." She looked at him, and there were tears in her eyes, but they were tears of relief, of victory, of finally being free. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we decide what comes next. Together." The frame narrative returned, then pulling back from 1875 to the present day of 1920. Old Gideon sat in his chair at the veteran's home, his grandson Samuel listening with rapt attention. "So you married her," Samuel said. "Grandma Catherine. You married her and raised those babies as your own." "I did. We built a ranch about 50 miles from Denver. Nothing fancy, but it was ours." The twins. Rose and Lily grew up strong and smart. They're your mother and aunt. They never knew the first 3 weeks of their lives. Never knew how close they came to dying in that cave. We thought it better that way. And Theodore Brennan. He died in prison. 10 years into his sentence. Heart attack. By then Catherine had made peace with it. She'd done what needed doing, said the truth, seen justice served. She didn't need his death, just his defeat. Samuel was quiet for a moment, processing the story. Then he said, "The girl I was telling you about, the one whose father hits her. I should help her, shouldn't I? Even if Dad says to stay out of it." "That's up to you, Samuel. But I'll tell you what I learned. Doing nothing is still a choice, and it's a choice you have to live with. If you can walk away and feel all right about it, then walk away. But if it's going to haunt you, if you're going to wonder every day whether you could have made a difference, then you already know what you need to do." Samuel stood up straighter. "I know what I need to do." "Then do it. And whatever happens, whatever the consequences, you know, I'm proud of you." The young man left his steps purposeful, his mind made up. Gideon watched him go, then turned back to the window to the mountains in the distance where all of this had begun 45 years ago. Catherine had passed 5 years earlier, peacefully in her sleep at the age of 62. She'd lived a good life, a full life, a life that mattered. And in her final days, she'd held Gideon's hand and thanked him for that first moment when he could have walked away but chose to stay. "You gave me everything," she'd whispered. "A life worth living, children who'll carry on, a name I can be proud of, justice for people who thought justice was impossible." "You gave me more," Gideon had replied. "You gave me a reason to stop running, a reason to be present, a second chance to be the man I should have been the first time." Now sitting alone with his memories, Gideon thought about Anna and Sarah, his first family. He'd never forgotten them, never stopped missing them, but he'd learned something important. Grief didn't have to be the end of the story. Loss didn't have to define you forever. Sometimes, if you were brave enough to risk your heart again, you could find new love, new purpose, new life. The mountain where he'd hidden for 7 years still stood unchanged by time or the passage of men. But the man who'd lived on it had changed, had transformed from a hermit running from pain into someone who faced it, fought through it, and came out the other side with something worth keeping. Justice, family, love, the things that mattered most, the things worth fighting for, the things worth living for. And in the end, that was the only reckoning that really mattered. Not the one in the courtroom, not the one that sent Theodore Brennan to prison, but the internal reckoning that let a broken man become whole again, that let a beaten woman find her strength, that turned 2 orphaned infants into thriving children with futures bright and uncompromised. The mountain's mercy, Gideon thought, looking at those distant peaks. That's what it had been. Not punishment or exile, but the chance to heal in solitude before being called back to the world to do what needed doing. He closed his eyes and let the afternoon sun warm his face, content with the story he'd lived, the choices he'd made, and the legacy he'd leave behind. A legacy not of violence or power, but of standing up when it mattered, of choosing courage over comfort, of being there when someone needed you, even when it cost you everything. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.